So good afternoon. Yes, we are already in the afternoon. That's the last panel of this morning session. And we will address the view, what does it mean, what does impact mean for investors? So we will look at the perspective of investors and banks. So I think it fits very well with the last discussion of the final discussion of the last panel. So I'm happy to have on the panel three people with very different background and very different perspective and probably vision on the issue of investors and impact. So we have Professor Harry Hummels, who is a professor at the University of Maastricht, and he is also managing director at SNS Impact Investing. We have Vincent Dessin, Director of the European Center Research, Harvard Business School. And we have Aaron Horvat, who is the project manager at CSR Europe, especially working on a project which is called Valuing Non-Financial Performance and Ethics in Finance. I just would like to tell you a few words before we start the discussion. So yesterday it was said that investors can have a huge influence on corporations and other actors in society. They can really make a difference if they want to. But in this project, we also have seen that investors are not considered as really influencing the agendas of corporations with regard to CSR. I think we have talked about SRIs, socially responsible investors, but still SRIs is a small community within the investment or investors community. Moreover, investors that do take into account CSR usually they consider the performance, CSR performance, rather than the notion of impact. Which leads me to one question maybe, but we talk about sustainable funds. So if sustainable funds do not consider impacts, what do they mean by sustainability? Maybe we will address this question later in the discussion. We also know that it's very difficult to measure impacts. We know that there is little information available in terms of reporting. We also know that it's very complex. It was also mentioned earlier this morning, this notion of co-production. So how can investors evaluate this notion of impact? That makes it very difficult. We also know that considering impacts requires to consider the societal level rather than the firm level. However, I believe, and maybe the panelists will comment on that, but most of the models and tools used by investors to make decisions are based at the firm level rather than the society level. So considering impacts would really require investors to develop new tools, new matrices, new models, and new criteria to integrate this notion of impact. So quite some changes to be made to integrate impact. So it leads me to my questions for the panelists. I have basically 4 questions. What does CSR impact really make sense for investors? What does it mean for investors? Can they use the notion of impact? Is it useful for investors? And how the notion of impact thinking can really inform decision making by investors? My second point or question is about if investors really want to integrate this notion of impact, what does it require in terms of models, in terms of tools, in terms of knowledge? What are the needs? What are the challenges for investors to really integrate this notion of impact? The second question is about, are investors legitimate actors to consider, evaluate, and decide on impact? It brings me to the question, what is the role of finance or the limits of the financial industry when thinking about impact? And the final question to address is about, can financial actors help to advance corporate impact assessment and management? Can they use the model CIAM that has been developed in this project, and how can they use it and help to develop it even further? So what can we expect from the financial community and from investors with regard to impact? So with those 4 questions, I will go to Vincent Dessin, and maybe if you can give us your thoughts. Don't hesitate to be provocative, to raise questions. That's the aim of this debate here.
Thank you, Céline. Maybe on the first question briefly, the value definitely is there for investors. There's no doubt about it. The trouble is that we are looking at a spectrum of investors who are deeply engaged and some investors much less. For example, when you look at investors that are motivated by social goods, for instance, the special funds that come out of the socially responsible investment stream clearly have specialized and have certainly a deep interest and also knowledge to assess whether companies really have had some impact. And I think that's certainly one stream. We also have, something that we talked about in the previous panel on small and medium-sized companies, particularly in Germany probably, Mitbestimmung. Mitbestimmung is another way of looking at some CSR issues, because you have unions and you have employees on the board and they discuss these issues and they come up with some resolutions. In fact, we looked at a company, a large company, Allianz, that has transferred Mitbestimmung at a European level, where some French and UK people have to deal with these issues too, and I think that's healthy. Legislation, or at least regulation, Céline knows that in France there's a requirement for companies to invest a certain percentage in socially good-driven companies, and so some of these companies don't know how to do that, so they get help actually from some groups who are more specialized in these fields. One example in France is SOS Group, which is a company that actually uses a business model to run itself. They don't have volunteers, they only have employees, but they have a social purpose, and they help companies that need to invest in these fields through private equity. They help them actually to look at social good, and has there been impact the way we define it here at the conference in their model. So that I call that a hybrid model, which I think is something that we need to look at and that we need to defend. Even at a larger company level, there has been examples of activists or funds that have been very vocal in pursuing the CSR agenda. An example is the Norway Fund with Total. It's an old story, I know, but they put their foot down when Total went too far in Burma. And they basically said, we will not continue to invest in Total if you take these measures. And Total actually changed its mind. Management basically took some different directions. I know there has been case studies on the cooperative and on John Lewis, and I think these models can also be another way for employees, for consumers, to further a more democratic kind of platform and to pursue things that are other than profit. And I think this is something that Europe does well and probably better than some other continents, and I would like to see more of that. So just to summarize on this first question, I do think that the investor model can work in juxtaposition with social purpose. I think today there are certainly companies where it is hard to achieve that, just because the board has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, we know that. But we've seen a migration to a stakeholder model. I mean, some people jokingly say that it's a shakeholder model because there is conflict and there is opposition sometimes between different stakeholders like employees and shareholders, and there is discussion and debate. But we're much further along, and I'm pretty optimistic. I think to To Simon's point on crowdfunding, on angel investment, we're working with a firm in Zurich that does angel investment with impact dimensions, and they're looking at crowdfunding now. This is perhaps a bit risky. This should be regulated for sure, but there may be more democratic avenues of channeling money to good purposes. So I'm pretty optimistic that these things can progress and be put in place with a more long-term purpose, and not looking for immediate returns, and be a bit more patient.
So there is hope for the financial community to integrate impact and have an impact on companies. Maybe Harry, your point of view.
To be honest, I'm not that optimistic. I work a lot, and actually I am part of the mainstream financial community. And I worked a lot with large institutional investors, large pension funds, large insurance companies, etc. And yes, they have their token projects. They do invest, coming back to Simon's question, yes, they do invest in impact, and in impact companies or in impact funds. And yes, it's going to be more than simply a niche, a very small niche of the allocation of funds to all kinds of socially desirable investment projects or investment companies. Nevertheless, if you understand what an investor is looking for, what a mainstream investor is looking for, a mainstream investor is particularly looking for creating additional financial value within certain limits. So yes, they will take ESG issues into account. Absolutely. If you look at the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investing, you can see that most of the large institutional investors are currently signed up as members. And yes, they do value all kinds of social and environmental issues. But why are they doing it? First of all, let me say that this is a very good report when it comes to the analysis. There's a second part on the recommendations, which I do not like as much as the analysis, because it applies a different type of thinking, but we may be coming back to that shortly. What I wanted to say, actually, with this analysis, you put the finger on the spot. The analysis shows that large institutionals, the companies, that is, are, for instance, motivated by outside pressures. Those pressures come, for instance, from NGOs, but currently also from institutional investors. And institutional investors means that they take this business very seriously. Vincent just mentioned the notion of engagement. Large institutionals engage with companies to make sure that the externalities is a really important notion here, that the externalities, the cost that companies make and actually transfer to society, they don't have those costs on their own budget or balance sheets, but they transfer that cost of, let's say, climate change to society. That is something that ultimately doesn't work anymore for institutional investors. And let me give you a very clear example. Storebrand, a large institutional investor coming from Norway, recently decided to divest some of its major oil stocks. Why did they do that? Why did they want to reduce their exposure to the oil sector, to the mainstream oil sector? Basically because it becomes a financial risk. In due course, climate change is the same as or equals a financial risk. So they only want to invest in those oil stocks that also are currently investing or have an eye for renewable energy. That's the way of the future. So these investors simply use common logic, I would say, common financial logic, to decide what is important for them and what not. And I fully agree with what Bruno Conte just said in the previous panel. They are simply not so much interested in CSR. They are particularly interested in corporate responsibility, skip the S, and look at the business and the financial side of that business. Within the limits of the law, within the limits of what society currently accepts as externalities that can or cannot be pushed forward or put on the plate of society. Let me stop here because...
So does that mean that investors are constrained by their own models and therefore can't really integrate this notion of impact?
Oh, they can and they do, as I said. There's a huge wave when it comes to impact investing, but that's allocating money to, for instance, microfinance, to renewable resources, to housing, affordable housing, very often in bottom of the pyramid countries. So it's most of the time investing in developing and emerging economies, and they invest billions. But Bruno was right when he mentioned, what about, for instance, Europe? Gradually, this is coming to the agenda. So there's now a new pact, for instance, in the Netherlands, that pension funds are willing to invest in small and medium enterprises in the Netherlands because they need money, and we need to find alternative ways to deploy the capital to create, for instance, employment in Europe, and not necessarily only in emerging or developing countries. That happens, but that's only, let's say, marginally relevant to pension funds. Let's say they make a 2 or 3% allocation to impact investing with clear objectives, but the rest, 97%, is basically invested according to common logic. Mainstream thinking, that's it.
Thank you. Aaron, maybe your perspective?
I'm really flattered to be in this panel. Thank you very much for having me, especially on such a short notice. And I hope I can contribute with my perspective to the issue. So just to make clear where I come from exactly, the projects mentioned are actually 2 projects within CSR Europe. One is on valuing non-financial performance, which is on the table for 5 years basically, and we've been working on it together with ABIS now. And this had two streams, a company stream and an investor stream. I will come back to this as I will give my input to the topic. Ethics in finance is a nascent new project which I cannot really talk about too much because it's being pitched. We do have results on a research from 2012, but this is not really the topic of this panel, so I will stop here. And my vantage point is basically from these experiences, from the group sessions that we had on each of the projects, plus my individual conversations with our member companies and some non-member companies who work in this field, who are investors, banks, more generally banks, and some specialized only in investments. What I see here, I would also like to touch on the business side of the question a little bit. I know it's been discussed quite broadly and quite in detail in different sectors before. But for what we see from the company stream of this project, where we surveyed 19 companies and we work with them in workshops, getting their feedback on what they think is important in terms of CSR maturity and integration, is that companies' main issue, I mean, at least these, let's say, enlightened advanced companies in CSR, if we can term them like this, is the main issue is still to understand and innovate internally to create this oft-quoted shared value. And shared value, from just seeing one article I read yesterday, but I think everybody knows a lot of articles about this. is based on how a company understands what the social impacts are of its business, and it has to do its research or engage in partnerships that will allow to understand this social impact. So to achieve this, I think companies do need to, based on this research, we see that companies do need to mature in terms of the management of non-financial performance and also the integration of it, although I would contradict a little bit, or it's maybe not a contradiction because it was referring to the SME level, that CSR departments are quite high up and close to the CEOs in these companies, at least in these multinationals who we can term as advanced companies in terms of sustainability management. But still how to manage sustainability, how to set KPIs, targets for the company internally in different drivers and different metrics related to it is still a challenge. And of course, the integration itself from the side of how different departments collaborate is also still a challenge, which leads this collaboration, this understanding of the social impacts, collaboration internally and externally, especially with stakeholders, which was often referred to now, is very important and is still something that even these advanced companies, I think, maybe it's too strong to say struggle with, but at least the integration of the non-financial and financial dimensions still need to be improved somewhat. And if we talk about shared value creation, the linkage to social purpose is very important. And now I'm coming to, if this maturity is, let's say, improved, then the transparent reporting about it is very important, and reliable data provision will be very important for investors. In case in point, for investors to understand their clients, the businesses, and be able to assess the risks. As one of the companies that I talked to last week said, basically this is the business of banks in general, but investors I think more in particular, to understand the business of clients and to be able to understand the risks. And as my highly honored panel colleagues here said, that understanding the risks of sustainability is still something to work on, as financial risks are most often taken into consideration rather than the larger set of risks and how these impacts play out for companies. So again, based on these discussions and on on some of the feedback from other forums as well, namely in 2 weeks ago in Berlin, there was a conference on the future of sustainability reporting, and there the DVFA FAS representative said that still investors are not understanding probably more than the calculations, the investment calculations that they are doing, whereas to understand sustainability, only quantifiable metrics will not be appropriate. So some of the issues will have to be qualitative and taken into consideration as a common sense of the person dealing with the...
May I react to that? Because I do think if you talk to large institutional investors, they do understand that there is a qualitative issue here on the table. There's no financial analyst that simply goes for, if he wants to do some fundamental analysis, that is, of a company, he will always take non-financial issues into account. And for instance, quality of jobs, so the human factor is a very important one. Climate change is an important one if it's relevant for a specific sector like the oil industry, for instance. But they would phrase it in different terms. An institutional investor would use the notion of quality of management, because ultimately in quality of management, lots of those intangibles come together. They look at, is this management really in control of the company, and is it inspiring its own people to do the right thing, and create financial and economic value for the company and for its shareholders. But they do have that notion of a broader stakeholder view. They do take that into account. The question is, they might do it differently than using the criteria that many CSR academics, for instance, use. They use a different type of thinking. And coming back to some specific ESG issues, if you talk to an analyst, a financial analyst, what he will do, he will indeed make a calculus of all the important financials. So he will have a view whether this company is going to add financial value in the near future, not only whether it did in the past, but whether it's going to do that in the near future. And then ultimately, every analyst will, after having finalized his analysis, he will push back his chair and then look at the total. Is this a fair assessment or valuation of the company? So there's a lot of, sometimes even gut feeling, that plays an important role in deciding whether this company is on the right track or not. That is very important to understand if you talk to institutional investors, whether coming from banks, pension funds, insurance companies, it doesn't matter, asset management. They all do more or less the same. They value the company using the fundamental information, financial as well as non-financial, and issues like, indeed, the human resource factor, the climate, the natural environment. So use of natural resources in certain areas is very important. And you see large companies actually picking that up. If you look at Unilever with its sustainability living plan, with Danone working together with Grameen, if you look at McDonald's, if you look at Nestle, they all have these large programs, and actually they report on their impact, because they do that for strategic reasons. If you go to the Sustainable Living website of Unilever, you'll find a progress report, a report on progress. You don't have to ask for that very often it's the other way around. If you are going to an investor relations meeting with Unilever, the management wants to push its envelope of, look, what a positive impact we have on society. We're reducing half of our footprint, our environmental footprint. We provide access to all kinds of products that are beneficial for the poor. We reduce our water use, etc. So they will tell you. Question is whether it's credible or not. But it's really an interesting dynamic. So there is a strategic reason for companies to report on impact if they have something to tell. That's the opportunity side of the business. But there's also, and that is what CSR also, or corporate responsibility in a broader sense, is also about, and that is where we are confronted as society with externalities we don't want, and that corporations don't want to report on. They don't have an intrinsic motivation to provide us with all the impact information. It is our interest as society, as academics, NGOs, the media, you name it, the consumers ultimately, to not be exposed to all kinds of externalities that companies would like to put forward or transfer to society.
I have seen several hands in the air in the audience, so I would like to give now, can we have the microphone? I think Johan, and then Regina. Oh, Regina, and then Johan, sorry, Johan.
I have a question actually, because you know much more than I about institutional investors and why they do certain things. You have told us the example of the Norwegian institutional investor that has decided to sell certain stocks of certain oil companies. And the question would be, why didn't they do so 10 years ago? Or put it the other way, what triggers institutional investors to change their minds or to come up with certain decisions when they think, oh, now we will sell this because the risk is too high that we might lose on these stocks? Because 10 years ago already, researchers at least and many policymakers foresaw that this could happen. And one of the interesting findings in the impact project in how far is there a congruence between companies perceiving an issue as important and that they act on it, was that in the field of rare metals or precious metals, for example, in the automotive sector, they said, yes, we are aware that this is an issue, that there's a scarcity, that there's risks involved, and still they don't really have programs on that yet. A bit different in the ICT, but how can institutional investors trigger? How do they make up their minds? What must happen to change these things? And I totally agree, or I can very well imagine that for institutional investors, some of the kind of externalities which are not debated, which are not being perceived as a risk, even if they are there objectively, they don't care about them. So it's probably institutional investors alone cannot change all these things, but they can play a certain role in certain situations. And the question would be, what kind of situations do we need in order to have institutional investors as triggers?
Right. I can address that issue. I think what Harry is pointing towards, and this is coming as a big truck entering this conference room, is that externalities have to become internalities, and that the pricing of these externalities into the cost of doing business needs to be an actuality. That's where we're going. So how do we make that happen? Well, to me, there's several angles to this. One is reporting. Companies need to basically come up with a real reporting of producing oil, of extracting rare materials, and translate that into the results. And that we don't see. That was actually what I brought up early in the morning, is to say a lot of companies are not doing financially so well if the pricing of these externalities were internalized.
Absolutely.
Okay?
It would be a disaster.
It would be a complete disaster. So let's get real. Let's get real here. If we get real, and especially for large companies which are really, anyone has seen the Nestle documentary on how they use water and how they basically pump water at the disadvantage of some regional, places like in the US, like in Pakistan, and this needs to stop. I'm sorry. This needs to stop. And the way to stop is to have some fairly serious mandatory reporting and some serious, regulation coming in here, kicking in, which is not going to be perfect in the beginning because it's very hard to regulate these things. And companies are smart. As Harry was saying, they'll find an escape route. They'll find a way to shift. But I'm sorry, we're at a day and age where we can no longer continue like this. Now, this is the environmental aspect. Now, when you look at the social aspect, that's even harder. Because to regulate a company in the way they recruit talent, in the way they deal with elderly people in the company, that's a lot harder to regulate. But I think there's certain things we can do. The auditing function needs to change in the way it assesses these things. The reporting issues, are certainly something. The governance of boards needs to change in the way, some of the board expertise needs to have these things internalized too. So I think I'm getting closer to Harry's point of view here. I don't know.
Harry, I don't know if you want to add something. There are two other questions, and I just want to bring one other point, which is, I think, very much related to that. It's the question of materiality, which is key in the discourse of investors and maybe also bring a problem somewhere. So I don't know, but Harry?
No, actually, I think it is, and Aaron can probably tell a lot more, because he has already worked on a project within CSR Europe for 5 years on the notion of materiality. 10 years ago, coming back to your question, To institutional investors, the notion was not material. Today, it has become material. And I fully agree with Vincent. There is a lack of information. And how do we get that information across? First, we have to gather that information. And second, we have to have credible resources for chasing after companies as well as investors to make clear that there are material issues here on the table. Because institutional investors, they don't do anything if it's not presented on the plate and if they don't actually, if they are not necessitated to take action. It's just like companies. The external pressure coming from NGOs, for instance, or from the public media, etc., is so important to change something in our society. So ultimately it comes back to us as consumers, as academics, as simply citizens in our voting and political behavior, in supporting all kinds of NGOs. If we don't do that, if there's no collective action, I can tell you the institutional world is a collective force, and they have the same rationale. They learned that in business schools, namely, there's one word for that, the single bottom line. That's what drives them.
I don't know if you want to add something, and then we take the two questions.
Yes, I wanted to add to the... Okay, sorry. That I think what I see in certain of the companies that I talk to is that the investor push is real. So it's there, and it actually fosters collaboration within the company, because sustainability people sometimes say that investor relations never came to them asking for what is our performance in ESG issues with big eyes. So this is, I think, one notion. Of course, probably this is marginal, so it's not mainstream. And I wanted to also make a point that the Nestle's and all the companies that Harry listed are basically, they are less a small group of companies who do this. The shared value creation, where they are always portrayed as the front runners, is still in its infancy. And we have reporters, or the most advanced companies, which I mentioned. If we just look at sustainability reporting, is still not the majority of large companies, even in Europe. And from that perspective, I think the investor push is very important. For me, the question there is whether the ESG investing will be mainstream or only marginal, and also whether impact investing is only a philanthropic activity or more going to the mainstream. And I guess there are examples for both, but it's still the situation now is still that these are more marginal and less big volume producing activities. On the company side, I think besides the investor push, the legislative push will be a very important one if the transparency directive finds its way to be implemented on a national level, and it's actually becoming a directive. So there also companies will be more respondent to these issues, and why is reporting very important is that it can also foster and induce better management of certain issues. What gets measured will hopefully get managed, or vice versa. So the bottom line of all this is that we still see a capacity building need on both sides, and also in other players like governments, for example, to be able to provide the legislative push if needed. Not rooting for a legislative push, but I think it's a very good motivation so far. If only this is supported by some smart support mechanisms for companies and I think all the other players to be able to build capacities and do these exercises of coming together, build collaborations externally. I think I'll stop here.
I would like now to take the two questions. Can I see how many questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4, 5. Okay, we will take 3 questions. Maybe Johan, Jeremy, and Simon, because you are together. Oh, you also had a question, right? Maybe the two because you're next to each other.
Okay.
Easier.
I have a question to Professor Hummels that focuses on the SMEs. As I presented this morning, my impression was from SMEs that they find that banks do not take into account the theme of corporate social responsibility in deciding on giving credit, supplying SMEs with credit. Now, it's basically similar to what you're saying about institutional investors and analysts, that but still you say, well, they do take account of ESG ratings because they are aware that it might have a financial consequence. But my impression from SMEs is that banks just only look to the financial parameters and hardly take into account even this kind of. So my question is, what is your experience within SNS Bank, and what could banks do in this supply of credit? Or what kind of procedures, or can it change somehow? What is your impression? Because banks often say that corporate social responsibility isn't important for them, but if you look to their practice, apparently it's not there.
Maybe next question, and then we take the 2 questions together.
So my question relates to impact investing, not socially responsible investing, but impact investing focused on social welfare or environmental challenges. And my question is around when a financial services company is measuring both the financial returns and the social or environmental impact, are there potentially disincentives and risks for that institution, because particularly when they're addressing a social challenge, healthcare delivery, poverty reduction, etc. And I have heard this from people who have managed impact investing funds, very large institutions, that the fundamental risk is for the institution and potentially for investors, if they're measuring the financial returns and their social impact, there's a risk to being perceived as, one might say, making money off the backs of the poor. And what I'd love to hear your response to is that a disincentive potentially for large institutions to get into this space because it's too great a risk? And the remark I heard from a gentleman who managed an impact investing fund at JP Morgan was, when he proposed the fund, the first question he was asked by the CEO is, oh my God, could this be a public relations disaster for us? Please just don't embarrass us. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
If you want to take those 2 questions, Harry, do you want to start?
Very briefly on Johan's question, I think, let me be very clear on. You mentioned that I had mentioned that large financial institutions and analysts coming from the mainstream would take into account ESG ratings. They don't take into account ESG ratings, they do take into account ESG information that is material to them. And that's a huge difference. And that, to a certain extent, also applies to SME finance. But I do agree with you, Johan, absolutely. If you look at the current situation, banks are simply working on how to reduce their exposure to whatever they can invest in, and certainly if that entails a risk. The bank will only lend you the money if it has a guarantee of at least 110% that the money will return to them. That's not investment. That's simply providing the bank an opportunity to earn money on our behalf as SMEs, or on behalf of large companies that do business with. The only thing that they provide is liquidity at a moment when the SME or the large institution actually needs some liquidity. That's the only thing. And I am very happy with the fact that now institutional investors step in to develop a fund that ultimately leads to more opportunities for small and medium enterprises to get access to finance, because it is fundamental for our economy, whether it's here in Europe or let's say in the developed world or in the developing world, it doesn't matter. Also in the developing world, lots of viable and very interesting small and medium enterprise don't have access to finance. That's why currently we are setting up with the Dutch DFI FMO a fund that invests in small and medium enterprise finance. We invest in banks in emerging economies so that they can invest in small and medium enterprises. You cannot do that from the Netherlands. You cannot select the SMEs that are really interesting from an investment point of view when you're sitting behind your desk in Utrecht or in London or wherever. You have to know the market, and local financial organizations or institutions do know that. So that would be my answer to you. And your
Can I comment on that first question? I tend to agree with Harry that it's a local thing, but I think he's a little harsh on financial institutions, not talking to SMEs. There are a number of examples in Europe of regional banks, of actually big organizations like KDV in Germany, which really is very much in tune with SMEs, and who look at, who embed some of these CSR issues in their decision to allow credit or not. Now, it is true that the crisis has not helped. I mean, in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, the banks have had a very, very negative reaction in the crisis, trying to retract, being very careful, asking for more collateral, for more guarantees, and that clearly has stymied and stopped the credit flow, and there's been a huge criticism actually of the banking sector, of that reduction. Even governments have tried to step in to say, enough of this, you have to reopen the spigot so that SMEs can really survive and get liquidity. In fact, even the central bank, the European Central Bank, has forced the banks to have the credit flow back into SMEs by actually lending them at very favorable terms. Let's not forget that. That's actually quite a recent phenomenon, I think about 8 or 9 months ago. So I think, contrary to Harry, I have a more nuanced view of some banks actually addressing these issues reasonably well. Very much to local banks who know what the needs are of their local business constituencies. And yes, there's a bit of an unfavorable phenomenon going on because the crisis has really hit in a number of countries.
Thank you. Comments on the impact investing question, maybe? Reactions?
Yeah, very briefly, I share your point of view. Even though it's not necessarily in microfinance, I am actually responsible for 400 million euro investments, all coming from institutional investors deployed in emerging in 150 MFIs all across the globe. And there is a reputational issue, of course. There is a reputational risk, but it's not making money on the back of the poor. Actually, and that's the good thing. Again, just like Unilever shows its progress report, we have to show that, so there's an indirect incentive to report on what you actually achieve with the money and whether it is at the benefit of the poor, or whether it might impact negatively on the interest of the poor. So we have to report, and we will actually be followed by a lot of journalists, etc., whether we are actually doing that. And certainly the media are very critical currently on issues like land grabbing, microfinance, for instance, investing in infrastructure, and then particularly in dams, what kind of impact that has on local communities. The media are on top of you. You have to be open and honest in your communication. So actually that leads to increased impact measurement and reporting.
Jeremy, you had a question, and Simon.
For somebody who's not spoken yet who wants to ask, I'm pleased to
Go ahead, and then we have Wendy over there.
give it to Wendy.
She has one. I already gave her one.
Don't fight. Go ahead.
Hello?
We can't hear you, no?
Hello. Thank you for the panelists for the discussion. I found it really, really interesting. And we've heard how institutional investors are taking into account ESG factors, and new business models are emerging and new products are emerging. The question I have is quite a challenging one in my head. I don't know the answers. Because if you think of the finance and banking system as a whole, inherently it's quite short-termist in the sense of quarterly reporting, the pressures on businesses to kind of show growth in profits, growth in return in investment, etc. What does the panel view the answer to this? How do we change to a more longer-term perspective in what performance is and what investors expect?
I can address this. I think it's a multifaceted answer to your question. There is no one single answer. One promising avenue of this, to me, is the role of the regulating authorities of equity, basically the Autorité des Marchés in France. The Danes also have taken the lead here. Basically what they do, they embed longer-term holding of shares as an obligation for companies that want to quote on the exchanges. And this is now, the trouble with this is, I spoke with some commission people about this yesterday, the trouble is that it's done by member states. And so there is inequality and no convergence of the rules that need to be established in holding pattern of shares, investments, in liquidity, in how institutional investors need to behave. You may be familiar with an initiative of the Commission to actually determine what pension funds or institutional investors have established in their portfolios with UCITS. UCITS is an investment vehicle where they look at liquidity, at transparency, at disclosure, so that one can see how these portfolios are diversified, and one could very well look at a portion that has more social impact investing within these packages. But they need to be regulated, they need to be enforced, and I think the member state regulators, at least for quoted companies, can play a role in this, a very active role, because they also have an enforcement mechanism. If the companies don't comply, if institutional investors don't behave, well, maybe they can step in. Maybe in conjunction with some banking authorities that could also play a role in this, and lead the way of saying, some of these things now need to be at least monitored, at least watched, and one could step in that role. I think banks themselves can also play a role by working on consortiums of agreeing on certain rules, similar to what they've done in emerging markets with the Equator Principles. The Equator Principles have been quite enforceable with regard to things that Harry talked about with dams, for instance, in emerging countries. Well, why wouldn't these rules also not apply in Europe? There's no reason that they shouldn't kick in for European companies. And their, banks voluntarily have actually banded together and said, we need to do something about this. So I'm not saying that, everything has been cleared in that respect, but there has been some movement in this view.
Yeah, Harry, last comment, maybe Aaron. We will have to close the debate because I think you all want to eat something. Go ahead.
Okay, just to add to Vincent's perspective, I think there is an important role for the regulator to play here. So it's us as a society deciding on what kind of room we leave for financial institutions to add risk to our society, not only to the financial product, but to us as a society. So if you go back in time, in 1933, after the financial crisis, the US came up with the Glass-Steagall Act. That was reversed in the late 90s by the Gramm-Bliley-Leach Act, and that ultimately led to, and actually it was simply an opportunity for travelers to meet with, merge with Citigroup, or Citibank at that point in time, to ultimately create an enormous amount of risk infused into our regular economy. You can make a distinction between commercial banks and investment banks. At that point in time, these two came together, and our savings were simply used for investment purposes, highly risky, and we've seen what the result was. So actually, we need to rethink how much, are we really lenient on financial institutions to let them use our money for very risky purposes? I would be critical, much more critical than we currently are. The debate about the split off of investment activities from our regular banking activities, commercial banking activities, is still not decided yet. And I would say, let's simply go back to commercial banking with social added value, and at the other hand, investment banking, where someone who has the money and wants to take the risk can do whatever he wants with that money.
Thank you. Aaron?
Just one short comment. I was quite encouraged by a talk with Bank of America, where they seem to be in a cultural shift, especially in the European side of it, and we can be critical about these institutions, I know. But when a sustainability officer tells me that now with the CEO they have set up a new committee that deals with sustainability issues, and when they say that they're thinking about more 10-year horizons than 4 and 8 month horizons in investments, then I think it's an encouraging sign. Plus, I think the blueprint for investors put forward by Ceres, the US investor network, is also something that could have good reverberations as it tries to push for this longer-term thinking change.
I would like to thank you very much. I think the discussion is not over. There's still lots of questions to be tackled, but it's time for lunch. So enjoy the lunch, and thank you very much for the panel.